You know, I had a very short-lived career as a congressional aide to congressional intern to Barney Frank. Anybody knew Barney Frank? And Barney Frank was not an easy person to work for. And so you would be sent off to research some topic. I was usually doing things on housing. And then he'd come in and you'd brief the congressman. And he would say, you'd have your little, I'd have my outline and my 5 points I was going to make. And he would just say, I'm very busy. Tell me something I don't know. So here I've written a book about billionaires hijacking our democracy. And I would expect that many of you are like, well, tell me something I don't know, right? I mean, this is what we're living with. We're living through this extraordinary moment. But my modest hope is that maybe I'll offer up a few nuggets of things that you didn't know or hadn't thought about. And most important, what can we do together in this moment? And this is such an important time to be together, to kind of talk about this moment we're in, which I think Trump and the drift toward authoritarianism, I think, is a symptom of what happens when you have extreme imbalances of income and wealth and power. And historians like Peter Turchin have verified and documented this over the ages. When a republic, when a sort of self-governing society has too much of an imbalance of wealth and power, it moves toward authoritarianism. It kind of makes sense, because how do you sustain a minority rule that's benefiting a very few number of people when in a democracy you can't? I mean, Louis Brandeis, during the first Gilded Age 100 years ago, said you can have concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy, but you can't have both. And that's the moment we're in. My point is, we don't want to live in a society where the rules of the economy are rigged to funnel wealth to the top. You know, in 1983, there were like 13 billionaires but today we're seeing more and more concentration, not in the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. And so the question is, who has power in our society? Who is driving the economy to become more and more unequal? I have a chapter called The Roadmap to Richistan, where I sort of visit the various villages. There's Affluentville, the top 10%, folks who are comfortable. They have buffers around their lives. They're not look super wealthy, but most of their frame of reference is looking up toward the 1%. And then there's lower and middle Richistan, the top 1%, the top 3%. And then there's upper Richistan, the top 1/10 of 1%, people with like 40, 50 million or more. And then there's Billionaireville. So you know about Billionaireville, there's like 904, as of this week, billionaires from the United States. There's about 3,000 globally. So a third of the world's billionaires live in the US. Together they have about $8 trillion of wealth combined. And I would pinpoint that top 1/10 of 1%, upper Richistan, people with wealth in the 40 to 50 million and up group. Because I think what happens around that point, when you have $40 million, you are set. You're comfortable. Your life is, you're living in a bubble if you want to. Your children are pretty good shape. You have multiple houses. You may be flying on a private jet. You may be in a yacht. They're not just buying jets and more houses. They're buying senators and media outlets. And that wealth and comfort is translating into power. They have power over their own lives and own dominion, but when they cross that line, they start to have power over the rest of us. We have a powerful narrative that justifies these inequalities. And if I were to write it on a bumper sticker, it's everyone is where they deserve to be. If somebody's wealthy, it's like, well, they got up early, they worked hard, they created something useful, they applied their skills, they have grit, they took risks, you know the narrative, the meritocratic narrative. And what's interesting about that is there's some truth in that. There's a segment of wealth creation where people create something useful maybe, or they provide a service, or they find a niche. We don't talk about what we do as a society to create the fertile ground. We don't talk about workers, tax policies, and investments. It's all about the individual. but that is this powerful, powerful narrative. What I write about in this book is there's another stage, which is once you get to that 40, 50 million, you start to invest in wealth defense. You start to figure out how to fend off your competition, how to expand your monopoly power, and you move into the political capture phase, which is you use your wealth and power to influence laws and rules and regulations so that you can continue to accumulate. And now, then you enter what I call the fourth stage, which is hyper-extractive capitalism. Now you have substantial wealth, and a portion of that is going into the market, and I talk to people about this all the time. They're looking for high returns, 22.5% return on investments. Think of private equity funds and some of the larger pools of wealth that are going in and buying up hospitals, healthcare clinics, housing, and the like, and I'll talk about this, with the goal of squeezing more out of the existing real economy. So it's a predatory phase in the cycle of capitalism. We like to talk about virtuous entrepreneurs, but we don't want to talk about the stage at which wealth becomes predatory on the rest of the economy. That is what we're living through, and I'm going to specifically talk about that. That is how we are being burned by billionaires, and it's accelerating, and it's starting to occupy more and more of the parts of our lives. What are the ways you're getting burned by billionaires? One is you're paying their taxes. You're picking up the slack for the tax reductions that the billionaires have seen really for decades now. The billionaires hire that wealth defense professional class, and it is a class, to help them create trusts, to create dynastic succession, to play shell games with the money so that it moves to the shadows, so it can't be taxed, it can't be found in some cases, and to pass as much down the narrow bloodline and create dynastic wealth. That is what the wealth defense industry does. So the billionaire class is opting out of taxes, and you're picking up the slack. They have been investing in the political capture for so long that they're finding ways to help continue to shift tax laws so wealthy people pay less and everyone else pays more. What we don't realize is for 40 years, we've been shifting tax responsibilities off the wealthy onto workers, off of taxes on capital gains and wealth onto taxes on wages, off the federal tax system, which is more progressive, meaning it taxes the wealthy a higher percentage of their income, onto state and local tax systems, which are more regressive, off of corporations onto individuals. You do that for 40 years, guess what? The bill is showing up at your door for things that used to be funded at the federal level by a progressive tax system. Second, they're robbing you of your voice and your vote. And that's not to say your vote doesn't matter, but most of the time your vote is irrelevant unless it's aligned with one faction or another of the billionaire class. They love government shutdowns and gridlock because a big part of how the wealthy exercise power is to block things that are popular. 3, the billionaires are supercharging the housing crisis. Not only the problem of unsheltered, but the fact that people pay so much of their income in rent or can't afford to own a home. You know, it's not just gentrification. It's not just wealthy people bidding up the cost of land and housing. It's the wealthy billionaire-backed private equity funds buying up rental housing, converting it to short-term rentals, Airbnbs, and these are corporate-owned, and you can invest in private equity funds that are just doing that. They're buying single-family homes because they know that there's all these people that maybe could have bought a single-family home, but they're not able to in this market. And if you know anybody, if this is your own situation or you have family members who are trying to buy a home and they have to go out and compete with people who are making cash offers with no inspection, they're having to compete against wealth, and so they're stuck in rental housing. And the private equity and the billionaires understand, okay, we can make money off these folks. They're They'll never build equity. They're just going to pay us. And so they're buying up single family homes. There's a Minneapolis neighborhood that I've just walked around, blocks and blocks of single family homes. Half of them are owned by investor groups. Jeff Bezos is taking some of that Amazon wealth and investing it in these single family home investments. Mobile home parks. Private equity. Now, I got my start organizing mobile home tenants to buy their parks. Bernardston, Massachusetts. Resident owned. They own their park. No private equity person coming in. New Hampshire, 155 resident-owned mobile home parks. Protected and buffered thanks to the organizing work and all around the region. One of the investors who's buying up mobile home parks, and these are we're talking huge billionaire-backed investment funds. One of them is quoted saying, owning a mobile home park is like owning a Waffle House where your customers are chained to the booths. They have nowhere to go. And that's true. Mobile homes are not that mobile. So and then that doesn't even include all the luxury housing that's being built. In a lot of cities, you see these towers rising. In Boston, One Dalton Place. These are not residences. They're safe deposit boxes in the sky. They're places to park wealth, but they consume huge amounts of land and labor and capital and finance and worker efforts, building housing that nobody's going to live in, which is just a way to diversify your investment holdings. I'm going to own a luxury condo in New York, and I'm going to have one in Vancouver and one in Toronto, and I'm diversifying my wealth holdings across the real estate markets. And that doesn't even include all the billionaires from around the world who are coming to the US, parking their money here because we've become such a great tax haven. And people can, buy land in rural areas. Why is Bill Gates the biggest owner of farmland in the United States? It's not because he wants to grow vegetables. It's because he needs a place to park his wealth that isn't all in one place. A fourth way we're being burned by billionaires is it's taking the existing divisions and divides in our society and supercharging them. We have a 400-year-old legacy of racism in this country and a racial wealth divide that reflects that. The gap between white wealth and black wealth is, 12, 14 times. And in the years after World War II, that started to narrow. The racial wealth gap started to narrow, but now it's pulling apart again. And all the divisions the cleavages and divisions and fractures in the society are only getting worsened by an economy that's being organized to fund wealth to dynasties, inherited wealth dynasties, at the expense of everyone else. So I could go on about that. But, the reason why think about it, the focus on immigration right now is because the billionaire class understands we don't want people talking about billionaires. We want you to be deflecting your attention over here onto people who have very little power and who are vulnerable and targeting and scapegoating them. The scapegoating is absolutely necessary to maintaining this current division, dividing us against each other, dividing us against old and new, people of color and whites. That is part of and it's part of what we're living. They're trashing our environment. Now, I believe we all have a responsibility to address our consumption, how it affects the environment. We should all think about our carbon footprint and our own image and impact in that way. But let's be clear, the billionaire class are the super emitters. These are the folks who have multiple houses. They fly private jets, which burn 20 to 30 times more carbon emissions than a regular passenger. They tootle around in yachts. Their emissions are tens of thousands more than ordinary people. Now, and there's one of the harms of that is that if you're trying to build solidarity to together face a disrupted future, that's going to require all of us to make changes and behavioral changes. We don't have solidarity if I'm thinking, should I not fly, and should I invest in getting a different vehicle, or should we retrofit our house? And some billionaires taking their jet across town to have lunch with somebody else. Why are we asking the people who have having the biggest impact to not change their habits and standards of living? We're being played as chumps, and that's how people feel. So if we're going to get our act together to face the climate crisis, we can't have a group of the biggest impact people opting out. And then there's another segment of the billionaire class, I call them the fossil fuel billionaires. These are the owners and investors in oil, gas, and coal who are using their wealth, power, and position to effectively block the path to climate transition and run out the clock. They're personally, individually using their wealth and power in that way. I'm so mad about that I started a project on the website called climatecriminals.org. We're preparing the dossiers for the future tribunals so they know who's responsible for getting us into this mess. Check it out, climatecriminals.org. But those folks are exercising their power in a way that is deeply, deeply harmful. So we can't talk about the climate crisis without talking about concentrated wealth and power and the disruption that's caused. They're making you sick. They're buying up the healthcare sector, the hospital sector. Fortunately, we have a fragile but important local hospital. But if you look at nationally, I in the neighborhood in Boston where I used to live, we had Kearney Hospital, owned by the Roman Catholic Archdiocese. Most hospitals were started by religious organizations and civic groups with the idea of promoting the public welfare and health. But now we're seeing a third of all emergency rooms have been bought by billionaire-backed private equity companies. Lots of specialties. If you've had the unfortunate experience of going to a hospital in an unplanned way, you get a package of bills from the anesthesiologist group and this group and the Doctors Association, and a bunch of these are private equity firms, owned by private equity firms who invest. The first thing they invest in is billing, so that they can send you that bill every month reminding you that you still owe them money. Healthcare is a sixth of our economy, and it is the billionaire class understands this is an arena for hyper extraction. There's a lot of money there, and we can move into that space. So that, and I watched my Kearney Hospital, the Archdiocese of Boston, sell it to a private equity group, Severus Capital, who then created Steward Healthcare, and they bought 10 more hospitals, and they slice and dice them, and they take the real estate, and they take the profitable assets, and they sell them over here, and they take all these fees, and now we're running out of money, we're going bankrupt. But all along the way, they've been skimming, and this is our healthcare system. And then there's this other fact, which is healthy societies, the more unequal we become, the worse health outcomes are for everybody, because we have a breakdown in the solidarity we need to maintain public health. And we saw that during the pandemic. Matt Taibbi, maybe I think wrote one of the better sentences about this process. He was writing about Goldman Sachs. He said, Goldman Sachs is a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. That is extractive capitalism, well described. And apologies to the vampire squid, it's just trying to live out there in the ocean. One other one, very close to home. The billionaires are coming for your pets. If you love, as in our family, our animals are very important. Cats, dogs, chickens, all the animals around us, they're like members of our family. And we sometimes will make heart-based decisions, not financial decisions, about what we do to help them. And the billionaires know that. The wealth extractors know that. They know you're willing to go into debt to care for an animal. And so they're moving into that space. Veterinary clinics, emergency pet services, pet food, pet walking. Anybody ever heard of Rover.com or Wags? It's one like Airbnb app for dog walkers, matching you with people with dogs. I learned about this from my friend Kay. She says, yeah, they take a cut of every time I walk a dog. Who owns Rover.com? Blackstone, one of the biggest private equity funds in the country. Who owns veterinary hospitals of America, the Mars family, the Mars Candy dynasty. They own candy, they also own hospitals. And they're moving to expand their holdings, and they like to keep the mom and pop facade, but those are being snatched up around us. So they're coming for our pets. They know that we're willing, we love our animals, and we're willing to pay for that. And they want to skim that money. Last night I was going down this list, and my friend Chris Hoey is in a wheelchair, and he says, "Oh, I should tell you, there's 2 private equity firms that control all the wheelchair ownership and leasing around the country." I went to an airport at Hartford Bradley Airport. There used to be these kind of cheap parking lots where you could leave your car for $5 a day. Guess what? They all got bought up by these private equity parking companies, and at least most of you have to pay $15 a day because you don't have anywhere else to go because they bought them all. So part of the solution here is to put our lens on and understand what is that. How does this encroachment affect our lives? Go and look at your household budget. How much of that money is getting skimmed away, streaming services and this and that and all these things that we pay money, and the little bit of rents and fees that are being extracted all along the way. And, Uber Eats, there are a lot of billionaires were made from all these apps. What do these apps do? Not a lot. They're not cooking the food. They're not growing the food. They're not delivering it. They're not driving through traffic. They're just skimming off of the productive economy. They're extracting rents, what the economists call. They're extracting. So much more of our economy is being taken over by that. So to me, the way forward, one is just to talk to our neighbors. Talk to them about how they're getting burned by the billionaires. It's not the immigrants in our community. Let's be clear here. Let's kind of help and it's not the town select board who's trying to struggle or the town, meeting that's trying to struggle to pay the bills. Let's look at this picture that's emerged over the last few years. Let's map our community encroachment. We know there's a dentist office in West Brattleboro that recently was bought by a private equity firm. The school bus fiasco at the beginning of the school year, right? Cosmeticus Bus Company still has the name on the school buses, but they've been bought by a private equity company called Audax, created Beacon Mobility. They operate across 25 states, and they're the ones who locked out the bus drivers. This is a private equity firm encroaching into what was a locally owned business. Down the line. So let's look at the news and understand what's happening in Windham County. We're fortunate we have a lot of small, independent, vibrant businesses and local farms. We need to defend them from the billionaire wealth extractors out there. We have to talk about taxes and restoring progressivity. The narrative around taxes has been dominated by the cut taxes, shift taxes. We've lived through the shift, shrink, and now the shaft when it comes to taxes. And we need to sort of understand the architecture of that and go back to the great socialist days of Dwight Eisenhower, when we used to tax wealth at the federal level, tax inheritances, and invest in things that make everyone else's lives better. We know how to do this. It's actually a formula that some of us in living memory can have some recollection of. I'm a big supporter of what I call game-changing campaigns. Let's find ways to think of things that all of us really think are necessary. More affordable housing. What about a luxury transfer tax? I worked on this in Boston. We got a luxury transfer tax passed. Property sells over $2 million, $3 million. Portion of that is tax that goes to a fund for permanently affordable housing. Here we have the Vermont Conservation and Housing Board in Vermont. We had 35 years ago the foresight to create that. That's created the pool that funds the Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust and all these groups around the state and land conservation. But we could do more around the disruptive effect of luxury housing on our housing markets. Tax private jet fuel. Private jets don't pay their fair share of their airspace. and fund green infrastructure and transportation and ground transportation that's going to help everybody. Fund inheritances at a very high level. Fund that, right now the inheritance tax, the estate tax, if you have less than $28 million, you're not going to be subject to that if you're a couple. Tax inherited wealth, and fund education and job training. Become like some of the Nordic countries where we do that. So a game-changing campaign to me is like find things that people want and are willing to fight for, and and then pay for it with a tax on the harm. Tax the harm and fund the public goods. I think of it as kind of like the poison ivy, and some of you who are like plant people know, the jewel weed. It grows right next to each other. The ailment is next to the harm. And this is the case so much with what we're dealing with. The biggest, to me, concentrated wealth in the climate crisis, tax wealth and fund the climate transition. That's the next book. Fund, and globally there is a movement. You wouldn't know it here in the United States, but globally there's a movement to tax wealth and fund the climate transition. Join the satirical resistance. We need to recover in this moment our sense of humor. Think about the dancing green frogs in Portland, Oregon, who are greeting the ICE office. Tactically brilliant, bringing our humor. Now we know that the Trump administration is trying to provoke violence so that they can put in the Insurrection Act in place and shut down civil liberties. They're trying to provoke it. So that's why it's so brilliant to have this humorous, playful response. And some of you may remember the Billionaires for Bush 15 years ago. Well, we've relaunched Trillionaires for Trump. Now, I hope you'll go on Saturday to the No Kings March right here in Brattleboro or wherever you are. Think about 3 friends who don't go to marches and invite them to come with you, because this is going to be the day to remember. This is going to be the one where you're going to want to tell your children and grandchildren, I was at that second No Kings March, October 18th, 2025, when millions of people went into the streets to say, this is not okay. And maybe in a bunch of those marches, there will be trillionaires for Trumps standing out there saying, we love King Donald. We think we should have a king. Bringing a sort of sense of humor and irony, taking the message and taking it a little bit over the top. And that's the spirit of it. Now, they've launched a healthcare campaign. Think about healthcare. It's called Go Fund Yourself. You can look it up. So find our humor. It's important for our morale. Satire is a form of power. And in this moment, we need all the humor and satire and power that we can muster. And finally, if you're interested in this, check out the website I co-edit, inequality.org. Sign up. We have a weekly newsletter. See the faces on the front line and the work that's going on to address these extreme inequalities. And I thank you so much for your attention and patience. And I'm open now to your thoughts and questions. And,